Hello and welcome to this video on socialism and the state, socialist views towards the state. And the state has always had an important role to play for socialists. Socialists of all types tend to see the state as an instrument of socialism, the means by which it is to be brought about. For Marxists, a new worker state is necessary to repress the overthrown bourgeoisie. For democratic socialists, the state is the means by which a socialist economy can be administered. For social democrats, the state is a tool for the redistribution of wealth and for tackling the inequalities produced by capitalism. And for third way socialists, the state is a necessary source of investment in social infrastructure, providing the education and healthcare necessary both to attract investment and to achieve equality of opportunity. Yet there's a marked division within socialism on the class nature of the state. So, whereas Marx viewed the state as an instrument of class domination, didn't he? Designed to serve the interests not of society as a whole, but of a particular class within society. And so for Marx then, the state was effectively a means for one class to repress another. Now, before we move on to which class is repressing who, there's two implications of this view. Think about it. Firstly, it implies that the capitalist state, the bourgeois state, cannot simply be taken over and directed by a workers' government, can it? Because the institutions of the British state, for example, were crafted by the bourgeoisie specifically to serve their interests, to protect their property. So, for example, the first national police force in this country was created largely to combat the radical working class movements which emerged after the Napoleonic Wars, the radical movement that we saw depicted so graphically being brutalized in the film Peterloo. It's foolish, therefore, to believe that these institutions, this state that was created to crush socialism, to crush any attempts to redistribute property and power, to think that these institutions can simply be taken over and directed to socialist ends, since their very raison d'etre is to crush socialism. We've discussed before in class the example of Salvador Allende, who the elected democratic socialist in Chile in the early 1970s, whose government was overthrown by his own army, which didn't go along with his socialist program. Now, the second implication of Marx's very negative view of the state as an instrument of class domination is that ultimately, in the classless society that Marx advocated, the state would be unnecessary, wouldn't it? Because if the only purpose of a state is for one class to oppress another, if you don't have class divisions, you don't have classes, no need for a state. And ultimately, remember, Marxists seek to abolish class differences and therefore abolish class itself by abolishing capitalism altogether. If you think about it, collectivizing property would end the distinction, wouldn't it, between those who owned the means of production and those who did not, as everyone would become a joint owner of collectively owned property. So with class differences thus abolished, there'd be no need for a state. The administration of people, Marx writes, would be replaced by the administration of things. In other words, you'd have people peacefully cooperating to organize production in the common interests of humanity and the planet. No need for a state. Marx wrote in this regard that the state would ultimately, quote, wither away, as with no private property to protect, no class interests to enforce, it would become irrelevant and unnecessary. But this did not mean that Marxists sought to abolish the state on the first day of the revolution. They were not anarchists. On the contrary, they believed that a strong workers' state, which Marx termed the dictatorship of the proletariat, would be necessary to crush the resistance of the overthrown bourgeoisie. And this relates to what happened in Paris in 1871. In Paris in 1871, following the Franco-German War, the workers of Paris took control of Paris and created what they called the Paris Commune, the world's first attempt at a socialist state. And what happened was, no prizes for guessing, the army was sent in, tens of thousands of workers were killed in a vicious counter-revolution. And the experience of the Paris Commune in 1871 convinced Marx and many other socialists at the time that the new workers' state that they wanted to achieve would have to be ruthless, more ruthless than the communards were, if it was to avoid being drowned in blood. Now, certainly the Bolsheviks took this lesson to heart when they came to power in Russia in 1917. Lenin and the Bolsheviks set up their own state institutions, their own army, the Red Army, their own police force and so on, and determined to avoid the fate of the Paris Commune, they used these to crack down on any resistance to the new revolutionary government. So to summarize so far, the Marxist view is that the state is always an instrument for one class to repress another. The capitalist state, therefore, cannot simply be taken over by a socialist government, but must be overthrown by revolution and replaced with a new workers' state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, to preserve the gains of the revolution and prevent counter-revolution by the overthrown bourgeoisie. Now, the Marxist Rosa Luxemburg agreed with this basic view, although she had a different conception from Lenin on what that workers' state should look like. She rejected Lenin's imposition of a one-party dictatorship and said that the new state should be composed of the whole working class and not simply the Communist Party. Unlike the Marxists, however, democratic socialists such as the Fabians, people such as Sidney and Beatrice Webb, saw the state in more neutral terms. They believed the existing state apparatus could be simply taken over and directed by a socialist government to enact socialist policies. According to the Webbs, an elite of trained bureaucrats would run the economy in the interests of the people. The Webbs, remember, were gradualists and believed that socialism would come about gradually through the existing political institutions, namely Parliament and the civil service. The advent of mass democracy, universal adult suffrage, they argued, had rendered revolution unnecessary, as the working class could now use its electoral majority to bring socialist governments to power through legal parliamentary means. The state, for them, was simply the instrument of the government of the day, and with socialists in power, there's no reason it should not be directed to socialist ends. Social Democrats have generally accepted this view of the state, seeing it as a neutral instrument which could be directed to their goals of wealth redistribution and public service management. And for all three of these groups then, Marxists, Democratic Socialists and Social Democrats, the socialist state plays a particularly important role in the economy, as it was responsible for planning and managing the economy, or at least regulating and controlling it in the case of Social Democrats. For third-way socialists, however, the state's role in the economy is substantially reduced, as third-way socialists such as Giddens largely accepted the neoliberal belief that free market economies are more efficient than state-directed economies. Nevertheless, the social investment state advocated by Giddens still had an important role to play in creating the health and educational infrastructure needed for a competitive capitalist economy.